Good evening, everybody. As always, continue eating your soup. It's all delicious. Thank you, everybody, who brought soup or bread. And welcome to everybody online. We're glad that you could join us. I've talked to several people that regret not being here in person, so it's good that they can pick it up later online. In fact, I watched Joseph. I missed you last week, but I got to watch you. So tonight, this is our fourth and next to last Lenten study. Just a little recap. Zach likes to have recaps, so this is he talked about Deborah the first week, then Esther, and last week was Mary, Elizabeth, and Mary's mother, Anne, which was interesting to learn about from Joseph. And next week, right, is the last week with Mary Magdalene, so I think we're all excited about Mary. But tonight, I get to share with you about Saint Phoebe the deacon, which is why I picked Phoebe when Zach sent out the list. He said, would you like to talk about one? I said, do the deacon. And really, I only learned about her existence as a deacon in recent years, probably maybe a couple years ago now. So I was pretty excited when I learned a little bit about her and her role in the early church. And I hope you, if you haven't heard about her, you learned something as well today. Phoebe is commemorated by the Episcopal Church on September 3rd in our Lesser Feasts and Fasts. And just a little plug for any church nerds. You can get this online. I think 2022 is the newer version, but if you like a little history, and you can almost use this as a daily devotion. Because I'd say about 85% of the days have a saint that we commemorate. So you can learn a little bit about what they did in our church history. And that's part of what I have given you as a handout. One page has the collect and the lectionary that goes with her. And the back is a map. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So the Bible reference to Phoebe is found in only 2 verses of Scripture. It's found in the New Testament in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. And this is what the Apostle Paul says. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you. For she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. That's it. That's all we get. We've read everything about Phoebe. So to fill in the next 15 to 20 minutes, we'll break it down a little bit more. So I want to tell you a little bit of the history of the setting of Paul's letter to the Romans. I'm not the best geographer, so be patient with me. But the Apostle Paul was in Athens, in Greece, and then he moved on to Corinth, which was down on the peninsula, joining the southern part to the mainland of Greece. So that's kind of our setting. Corinth was a bustling commercial city, and it had seaports and a very diverse ethnic population, and temples, and they worship numerous gods and goddesses. And once in Corinth, Paul settled down for about 18 months, and he was preaching and starting new Christian churches. And this is where Phoebe comes into the picture. So Phoebe came from a very busy port area called Cenchreae, and I had to Google how you say this, so if it's not right, I'm sorry. Google failed me. And this was a popular stop for people traveling from Syria or Asia Minor, probably some seafaring Phoenicians to the east. Yes. Really, I'm not making this up. They really, there you go. So while in Corinth, Paul wrote a long letter to the Christians in the city of Rome, and he needed someone to carry it to the city of Rome. Phoebe may have been traveling for other business purposes. We're not real sure how she ended up, but maybe she offered to take the letter, and the two verses that we read about her is just introducing her as the letter carrier to the Romans, the Christian church in Rome. So what's it mean that she carried the letter? Was she just, like a UPS driver? We think if she carried the letter, she probably delivered it to the churches in Rome, and a number of theologians believe that she was not just the letter carrier. She probably had to memorize it and kind of understand its meaning a little bit more, so she could talk to the people in the churches in Rome, and explain the theology and what Paul was trying to share with them. And if she was that deep into the thinking behind the letter, then it's possible she even helped Paul scribe the letter. She may have been bouncing ideas off of Paul while he wrote the letter. To dig into these two verses just a little bit, Paul acknowledges Phoebe with three noteworthy accolades. And this is kind of where I want to break down these verses. So in our modern translation, he first calls her sister, then he calls her deacon or deaconess, and then benefactor. And this word benefactor is sometimes translated as patron, so keep that in mind when we're talking about it. So this first, sister. And in using this word sister, he really claimed her as a sibling in the church. It was a name of honor, and he didn't use this with a big number of people. So some of the other people that Paul used this term with were Apphia and Philemon, and he also uses the term brother for Timothy and two other people. So it's, it was a specific term that he used to describe her as sister. And then we get into deacon. He called her deacon. And the Greek word is diakonos. And sometimes we use the word servant. It's not exactly the same. It's not the same Greek word as is often used for slave. So, and this is where you kind of get into some translation differences, and it depends on how you translate this as to just how official her position as a deacon in the church was. So Paul describes her as the deacon of the church at Cenchreae, and he only uses this term for 5 people: himself, I think it's Tychicus, Epaphras, and Timothy, along with Phoebe. So again, and this isn't a term that's just thrown out there for everybody who was associated with the church or learning. It was reserved for kind of a special group of ministers. And all of us women probably have a strained relationship with Paul's writings. Just going to put that out into the universe. Based on 1 Corinthians chapter 14, we've all heard these. As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church.
Ain't happening.
I was counting on you to be the objector. Yeah, so, and this is the verse of Paul that I grew up hearing the most about. I didn't hear about Deacon Phoebe, so. So, I think that really speaks to the importance of what we're doing here today, to dig in and learn from a different perspective and kind of peel away some of the layers that have been added on from society. So, I don't know exactly why Paul was telling these Corinthian women to be quiet, but I assume that he was not talking to all of us. So, There's also some scripture about in Timothy that speaks of deacons, and our translation is usually referring to the wives of deacons. It's 1 Timothy 3:11, and the King James Version says, even so their wives be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. So the verse before is talking about the characteristics of a deacon, and then most translations we're used to hearing switch it and say the wives of deacons. Well, I found out in this study that if you go back to Paul's original Greek, which I don't really know how to pronounce this one, gonakes hosatos, but it can also be translated as likewise the women. So it's very possible that he wasn't talking about the wives of the deacons. He may have been talking about deacons being the women, women deacons. And it kind of changes the whole, context. So again, that's been kind of a verse that's been used to beat up women and their roles in the church, and you need to look into that a little bit more and be careful what translation we lean on. So with all that said, we can see that Phoebe was really a minister to the whole church at Cenchreae, and not just serving in the capacity that was reserved just for women. And we can assume that she was doing the same types of activities and ministering that the men who were later or similarly called deacons were doing. A fun fact, that historically, deaconesses were, of course, this is no surprise, but women were devoted to the care of the sick and poor women. We've heard that before. Deaconesses were often present at interviews of women with bishops, priests, or male deacons, so clergy wouldn't be alone with strange women. Yeah, strange women. And of course, they kept order in the women's part of the church. However, her most important function was the assistance at the baptism of women, because for the first 5 centuries of the church, people were baptized naked. And so for the sake of propriety, male deacons couldn't baptize women. So there's I didn't know that fact, so I'm throwing that out there.
We're bringing that back.
We're not. I think they started baptizing infants, and it made it a little bit easier. So we weren't exactly sure what all her duties were, but like I said, Paul gave her great recognition and was thanking her in public for her hospitality and for meeting the needs of the church people in Cenchreae. And he urged others to help her with her ministry as a deaconess of the church. And as a result of that, today, Phoebe is recognized as the first woman deacon, and we honor her as being the prototype of female deacons, just as St. Stephen is the prototype for male deacons. Now, there is some argument that there's a difference between the function and ministry of a deacon versus the ordained position of deacon. I didn't really dig into when it became an official title of the church, but I think when she was called deacon, it was before it was ordained. So, as for the men that were serving that as well. So we talked about her being a sister and a deacon, and the third one is a benefactor. And the Greek word that Paul uses, prostatis, can be defined as a woman set over others, a female guardian, a patron, caring for the affairs of others, and aiding them with her resources. A benefactor, she had money, so we're not sure how she got her money. She may have been a businesswoman. Maybe she was a widow and inherited. We don't know, but she used her money for the church and was generous. to help Paul and others in the early church. And I thought this was kind of interesting, the way they broke it down in one reading that I looked at, that they called her deaconess, and that was kind of a specific position for the church and that she served. But as a benefactor, they acknowledged that that was more widespread. So she kind of covered both ends of the spectrum. Like, she did specific work, but she also may have been a missionary. She may have traveled more. And St. was like her home base. It's clear that Paul wanted the community in Rome to know just how important Phoebe was in the leadership at Corinth. And like I said, she was likely a missionary. They may have called her an itinerant preacher, which I think is pretty cool. I can relate to that, going around. And she used her wealth to influence and grow the Christian church. She freely gave of her wealth to finance and spread new faith. And I already talked about this point, but just to reiterate, sometimes Paul gets labeled as being anti-women. But Paul's introduction of Phoebe really kind of sets a different tone entirely. So I think the other times that he was speaking was a specific situation for those churches. And I don't think Phoebe was the only woman. In fact, we know that Phoebe wasn't the only woman that worked with Paul. So I had names of the other women. Yeah, she was part of a larger cohort of women who partnered closely with Paul. There was Chloe, Nympha, Apphia, Euodia, and Syntyche, and Junia. So there were several women. So she wasn't just a one-off. She wasn't the only special selected woman. So, and if you want to look at the sheet, this is just a kind of, on the back, I pulled this paragraph here straight from the Lesser Feasts and Fasts. So just to give you a taste of what kind of biographies show up. It gives a nutshell summary of Phoebe's life. Phoebe appears once in Paul's letter to Rome, where she is referred to as both a deacon and in the church near Corinth and a benefactor of Paul and others. The fact that Paul commends her to the Roman church at the end of the letter suggests the possibility that she was the messenger, which would speak highly of Paul's trust in her. And we may often think that Paul did it himself. We hear a lot about Paul in all his letters. But there were other people, there were men and women that assisted in his spreading the gospel. So. I will end by saying, and I'm trying not to make this a sermon, but really, like what I said at the beginning, representation does matter. And it does matter that we find these women. And I really appreciate Zach coming up with this idea, and Joseph doing a fabulous job with not one, but 3 women in his lecture. It makes me excited that you all, St. James, and especially the Episcopal Church, do support women. And it's good to know that we're doing, I think we're coming back to what Scripture was true to back then when it started. Like, I don't think we're straying away and becoming culturally relevant. I think we're getting back to what it was always supposed to be. There was something that muddied it up for a good long while. So with that, I've talked a lot, and if you have questions or just want to comment, I'll open it. Oh, if you look at the map, Phoenicia's over here. It got cut off. Sorry, David.
Right here.
Yes, you in the back, Father Zach.
I'm
Amy, this is just wonderful, and I'm so grateful to you for bringing this. And the way you describe it, I mean, it brings it alive in my mind. You know, Paul's letter to the Romans, I mean, that is his treatise. That is his magnum opus. That was as good as he got.
Yeah.
You know, he put everything into that. And then, so you don't send that with a lackey up to Rome. No, you send that, I mean, I'm just making something go wrong, but I'm like, you put your most trusted person on that job. You know, somebody who you know can talk to it, and I thought that you did such a good job of thinking of, like, she had to actually understand that letter. And that letter is dense with incredible theology and an understanding of Jesus and the everything. You know, it's a super condensed, entire library. Hundreds of libraries have been written about that letter. And this, so Phoebe had to go to Rome and kind of pave the way for Paul. She was sort of his introduction up there. So cool to think about, like, her carrying that and then preaching about it in all these different churches. I think that's just so neat.
Yeah,
So thanks for bringing that up.
I didn't write it down, but there was one source that said something like Phoebe carried the future of the church, theology of the church in the folds of her skirt.
Oh my God.
Like,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool.
It's interesting that of all the names that you read, Phoebe is the only woman's name that has come down to today.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you can think of people named Phoebe, or the character on Friends, or a couple of popular singers. There's one now, Phoebe Bridges, Phoebe Snow.
I know one person named Udea.
Really?
Junia, Junia, is actually a mule in books that I've just read.
Mule.
She's named for Junia in the Bible.
A mule?
Wow.
It also says that Paul tells everyone to assist her in whatever it is that she needs you for, so she's also a leader. It says specifically that she's there to get you doing something for her, that she has a purpose for going, to be with that congregation or that group of people, and they are supposed to listen to her.
Thank you all.
Thank
And I do have some extra copies if somebody wants. In the